built-in I've been working on, and I'm going to start the beginning of this video is going to be showing you how I made the drawer boxes for the upper cabinets as well as the doors for the upper cabinets, and then I show some of the highlights of the install. So same process. If you've been watching this whole video, you see how I make drawer boxes. I'm putting dovetails on all four corners for this project. I have a jig that does that work pretty quickly. I size out all my pieces. The difference between these and the bottom drawer boxes is I'm using my preferred method, which is the Blum undermount drawer slides for this. So there is some math involved in doing drawer boxes this way. I have a video on my channel dedicated to Blum undermount drawer slide boxes, making them, figuring out all the measurements, everything involved in that. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly for this video. So basically I just have my parts that are going to fit in the box. I make them about an inch smaller than the opening. That's roughly the measurements they give you. These have to be a ½ inch space from the bottom of the hardware to the bottom of the box. So I'm just cutting the groove for that. I used ½ inch ply for this. Blum makes those slides. You could use anywhere from 5/8 to 3/4 is one set of slides. 5/8 and under is a different set of slides. One's labeled F, one's labeled H. Just make sure you buy the right ones. Now, because this drawer box is only a little, since the upper cabinets are only about 12 inches deep, I got 9-inch deep slides, and unfortunately for the ones under, I think 18 inches, they don't have mounting holes on the bottom of the hardware, so I also had to shim out the sides of this in order to mount these. That's the one downside of these really shallow drawer slides. And then because I did 4 dovetails on each side differently than how I usually make them, I had to notch out the back. I just used a router for that. If you get these slides, print out the instructions for them. They tell you all of that information. So then I could just pop those in place. Now, if you're using these slides, if you've never used them before, especially on shallow, wider doors like that, until you put weight in them, they are a little wonky. So don't be alarmed by that. Sometimes I actually throw some weight in the back of them just so that they work a little bit better when dry fitting them. So then for the fronts, same process. I just went through, added about 3/32 of an inch reveal to this, cut some ½ inch ply, use some cards to shim it out, and once again this is set back because this will be getting the fake trim on the front as well. So the trim I'm using for this is thin. It's about 3/32 of an inch, so I mounted this about 3/32 of an inch back of what I needed it to be. I could slice this up and then attach it to the front. So pretty easy stuff, especially after doing the bigger bottom drawers. I'm showing myself bradding this in place here. I completely forgot. I usually glue these in place. What you're not going to see is I pull this stuff off, put glue on them, and then brad them in place. The plywood was fit perfectly, so I just measured to the plywood, cut these strips, and then put them in place. So that is that bottom drawer box. And the sides, same thing. They just pop in place. Also with these slides, I always get the connectors that have the up and down adjustability, especially because gravity will start messing with you on these. Once I mount them and take the cards out, you could see it is already dropped in the box. So with the adjustability on the height, I could go through, click those forward a little bit, and it recenters itself perfectly. So with the drawer boxes done, I'm going to finish up this build with the upper cabinet doors. Luckily, I learned my lesson in the bottom, and these two cabinets are slightly different sizes, so I measured for both, measured height, and split them up, and got all of my rough measurements for my parts. They're not off by enough, but I can't make 4 identical doors. The height is all the same. Now, I've made many doors over the course of my career, and my openings are very square. So I really tested my luck with this one, and I basically calculated the reveal into these doors, and I made them almost perfect size to fit. And if I had to make a couple adjustments, I would, but height-wise, I'm making these pretty much perfect. I only do that if when I glue up my carcasses, they turn out square. If your carcasses aren't square, making the doors to fit will not work because you're going to have to make adjustments. So just be aware of that. If this is your first or second or third time making doors and you're still not comfortable making inset doors, I highly recommend making them to size to fit the opening and then go through and add that reveal afterwards. But I decided to do bridle joints on all these on oversized doors. That's just my preferred method. It gives you more gluing surface. So it's just going to make a stronger joint in the corner. It's basically just an open mortise and tenon joint, and you can see with all that added surface area versus just a regular ton and groove, which I do on smaller doors, just is going to make it sturdier. It also helps prevent racking, which you won't notice at first with stuff like woodworking, but you're building these things to last a very long time. With the built-in, you're building it to last forever. So just over the course of time, I find it to be a better joint option. That's why I do it. So I cut the open mortise with a tenoning jig, and then I could test fit for the tenon. Whichever joint I do first, I kind of cut it, and then I set up the second joint to fit. So that's what you saw, the test piece. I made sure it was perfect, and then I could go through on the radial arm saw and cut those tenons. I'm only doing 4 doors, so I didn't bother changing out my blade in there, but if I do a lot of doors, I usually change out the blade to a dado stack. It goes a little bit faster. You're not removing 1/8 of an inch of material. So I could dry fit everything. They looked pretty good in place. Could take them out, measure my opening, add the depth of the groove I have to all of my sides so that plywood will go into the groove, get my final measurements, and cut all the plywood for the inner partitions. This is 1/4 inch ply. 1/4 inch ply is usually true to size, but I've noticed the last couple times I've bought it, it's a little thinner than a 1/4 inch. So if you're buying sheet goods, just always make sure you measure. Especially if you're getting them at a big box store like I am, the sizes are constantly changing. It's a little frustrating. Like I said, usually 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch is pretty true to size. 3/4 inch is never 3/4. It's usually 23-30 seconds. Just make sure you measure and test that. Otherwise, you'll have a very loose panel. And then for gluing these up, I'm only gluing the corners. The plywood needs to move within that hardwood frame, so you really don't want to get glue on that plywood. And then I could check for square. You're going to measure your diagonals. Usually at this point, one side's a little bit longer than the other. You just kick the longer side a little bit towards the shorter side. It usually evens everything out. You can put clamps on these and let them dry. As you can see, one side was a little bit longer. I just kind of shifted the 2 sides, measured again, and they're pretty much perfect. The hardware for these are special Blum Inset face frame hardware hinges. So they're unlike the ones that go in frameless cabinets. They actually have this little clip that sits on the face frame. They kind of mount floating like this, and these are specifically for doors that have a face frame. Sometimes when I order these hinges, they come with these little plastic inserts. I take these off, they're garbage. The little screws in there, you can't even reuse them because they're like stub screws. If you're making your doors out of something like plywood or particle board, I would potentially use those, but hardwood, I don't need them. So then when mounting the doors, the poplar I used was pretty flat, which was nice, but if you have these doors and one of your sides isn't perfectly flat, that's always the side I choose to put the hinges on, because the hinges will help keep that side true. Because these are so tall, I decided to put 3 on each door. It's just going to help keep it square, make it sturdier, but also help keep it square on that long run that they have. And then obviously, and I've done this in the past, I made sure center is actually where a shelf is in my cabinet, so I'm mounting all of my hinges below center so they don't interfere with whatever's on that shelf. I can mark this, go through, just using a regular cup hinge for all of these, and then I can pop those hinges into place. I could attach those with screws and then mock them up in the opening. So in the opening, I have it in place. I'm just going to shim it up with some cards. You could see I made them to fit, so my reveal is pretty much perfect on these, which was nice. I kind of chanced that and it ended up working out. And then once it's shimmed up, I could go from the inside and mark where those hinges hit the face frame. Obviously, you could take a tape measure, you could calculate all this, mark them. I just find it's 10 times easier to pop them in place, mark them right off of the hardware. There's my 2 marks, and then I can attach, take the cup, the hinges apart. They come apart in 2 hinges. You can see they have slotted holes, so they just slide into place, and then I could tighten those screws. The style I'm working on now is the removable style, which is why there's such a big gap in there. But that is those 3 hinges in place, and then just like regular Blum hinges, they're all gonna kind of slide and snap into place. These are soft close. I always turn off the soft close mechanism when I'm fitting these doors, because otherwise you're just waiting constantly for the doors to close. And I could go through and see what it looks like mounted. There's always going to be some little adjustments. That's just the way it is. They don't come universally set. But my reveal, you can see it's a little wider at the top, which is causing part of that top to be lower towards where the center is. All I'm going to have to do is kick that top reveal over. It's going to lift the bottom of the cabinet and lift it up on top, and it ended up pretty perfect. These doors fit about as good as I could have hoped for. For the front of the drawer boxes, I specifically used 1/2-inch ply for the fronts, and then at 3/16 material on the front, so it's about 3/4, and I could just go through and edge band all this stuff. I don't film that process, it's super boring, but that is how I finished drawer boxes. And then I put a coat of, I patched everything. I used some Bondo. I prefer the setup time on that for projects like this. Then I go through and put a coat of primer on. The primer is going to raise the grain, so in between coats of primer, I just lightly sand everything with 180 grit sandpaper, remove all that raised grain. Now, I usually use a spray gun in the shop. I've had this one for years. I admittedly don't take very good care of it. It wasn't working great. And on these lower cabinets, because of the cup on top, coupled with the fact that you have the hose coming out of the bottom, it wasn't fitting in the cabinets very well. I didn't want to spend a lot of money on a spray gun. I really don't use them that often. I think last year I used a spray gun maybe 3 or 4 times. I went on YouTube, I saw a bunch of people saying this really inexpensive gun works very well. This is not a sponsored video. I just didn't want to spend a lot of money on a paint gun, so I bought it real quickly. I used it for this project. So far, I like it quite a bit. It did everything I could ask of for this project. I'm only priming this, which is a plus side. I just put 2 coats of primer on. They're having the whole room professionally painted, so far I do like that spray gun. So then, as you can see, I've been talking about scribing these cabinets, the whole build, and when you put them in place, this one over here was off quite a bit. I just used a scribe to make a straight line, a hand plane to even it out, and then that is basically the fit I'm looking for. I can go in the space, level my bases. The one downside to a desk, the nice thing about the desk is there's a very large void in the middle, so you don't have to make cabinets for it. But the problem is leveling the 2 sides, because the floor is never going to be level perfectly. Can be a little bit of a challenge. This worked out well. I didn't have a lot of tweaking to do. You can see on this cabinet I had that style that I added to account for the fact that the drawer boxes, I had to trim part of my cabinet. That one fit in real nice, and then I could pop my desktop in place, and this is what I mean. These 2 cabinets have to be level to each other, even though they're not connected, in order for the desk to be level. Like I said, that takes some shimming and some problem shooting, and these cabinets are quite large, so a lot of taking them on and off their bases, which is a pain, but it's really important you get all that level. And then I could start on the desktops, and like I said, none of these houses I've ever worked in, no house is totally square. These weren't too bad. You could see there's a gap in the back, so I scribed both sides of these. What I did for this is I had a thin piece of 1/4 inch, and I made these oversized already so I could remove some material. I made a straight line for that. And then on site, I had my router with a pattern following bit, so I just tacked a piece of 2x4 on there, use the router to trim that up so that the fit on both sides is nice. I don't get crazy about the fit in the back. Most of that back is going to be covered with a cabinet, and like I said, this is going to be painted, so hairline cracks and little bits and pieces I don't go crazy about. All of that is going to be caulked and painted. You're never going to see it. So like I said, you could see the cabinets are going to cover most of this back. There's a little groove that's cut out by the window for wires anyway, and then my seam, once I put my spline in place, is going to be pretty seamless. So that is the fit along the back wall, and then the side, this one I scribed as well. Like I said, nice tight fit on the side. This room didn't have any lights in it, which is why my camera looks so grainy, but I did bring a light with me, and that helped quite a bit. If you watched the table build, you know I said I was adding this 2x4 from the side so that it took a lot of the weight off these little wings that I had, but those worked out perfectly for setting it in place and getting everything set up. I didn't film it, but the underside of that I cover with plywood so you don't see any of that base. Before I did the pullouts, I added some basically really thick Teflon tape. They sell on Amazon. It's called like UHUV tape, something like that, and that helped these slide out. And then if you watch this video, you know I was a little concerned about the fact that you couldn't ever remove these once the top were in place. So before I installed this, I took the time to cut out a notch, create a new little piece of material that's screwed in place, so if they have to, the customer could remove these two pieces with the screws on the bottom and take that whole slide out once you take the T-bolts out of the bottom. So I was happy I spent the time to do that so those aren't stuck in there forever. And because there's a tabletop on this, you can't even really tell that those notches are there. So the right hand side of this wall was pretty flat. Like I said, you could see there's little hairline cracks. All that stuff will get caulked. I don't bother getting crazy scribing with that. It's one of the reasons I would never want to make one of these out of stained material, because you can't get away with caulking and patching. But the left hand side, the upper cabinet, had to be scribed as well. You could see how off it was in the earlier clip, and I just use a scribe to draw my line, and then I just use a plane to remove that material. Once it's in place, I can add that center groove there and put my cabinets back in place. And I always have this stuff perfect set in the shop. I don't know what it is. All these doors went back in the exact same place, but everything always has to be adjusted on site. This install was one of the longer installs I did for multiple reasons, but it ended up working out over a weekend. I was gone, and already from moving it to my shop and moving it to this space, you'll see in a later clip right here, the reveals on the doors are already bigger because the humidity in the house is lower than the humidity in my shop, and stuff has already started to shrink. So this is with crown on. I didn't film any of that, trimmed out the window, and then I ended up covering an old baseboard heater with a new piece of woodworking. That ended up being a nice little quick fun project, so I filmed that separately, and that will be next week's video. But this one's pretty much done. I hate to show just primed in the video because it doesn't look great just primed, but it is going to get final paint